Debate, the Honourable Minister of Status of Women.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples who've taken care of this place for generations upon generations. I'm standing in the House to speak to and urge my colleagues to support Bill C-86, the Budget Implementation Act Part 2, more affectionately known in this House as BIA2, and to speak to the measures that help grow Canada's middle class and support those working hard to join it. I firmly believe, Mr. Speaker, that when passed, these measures will help support Canadians across the country and will help to grow our economy. I also need to acknowledge the work of feminists who have come before us, those who have worked so hard, those effective trailblazers and courageous silence breakers who have brought us to this moment in time when we recognize that equality is a driver for economic growth. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this past October, we launched Women's History Month with the first online gallery that captures the stories of Canada's women of impact. This particular website tells the stories of women like Elsie Knott, the first woman to be chief of a First Nation in Canada, women like Louise Fish, young women like Faith Dickinson, along with the more well-known trailblazers like the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. Colleagues and Canadians are encouraged to Google Canada's Women of Impact, to read their stories. There is a teacher's guide so that we may share those stories in an effective way. And of course, Canadians are welcome to provide their nominations for other women whose stories ought to be on that website. I mention those women, Mr. Speaker, because our government is committed to continuing their legacies. Advancing gender equality is the right thing to do, and it is indeed the smart thing to do. We have $150 billion to benefit from in Canada's economy over the next decade if Canada's women participate equally in our economy. We will increase our GDP by 4%, we will fill critical labour shortages, and will ensure that Canada's middle class grows and we stay competitive. There are several measures in Bill C-86 to close the gender wage gap and to build on our government's existing efforts. I'd like to broadly speak to 5 of those. The first is the introduction of an act that will ensure that there is a new full department with a broader mandate to help Status of Women Canada evolve, and it will evolve into the Department for Women and Gender Equality, WAGE for short form. There's proactive pay equity legislation. We are legislating the application of a gender and diversity lens to all federal budgets moving forward. There are provisions in there around a shared parental leave, and there's also a new benefit in there, 5 days of paid leave for survivors of family violence. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin by speaking to the enabling legislation that will ensure that the Department for Women and Gender Equality is able to build on the good work of the small but mighty agency that is Status of Women Canada. And I will take this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to thank my predecessors, as well as the team at Status of Women, who, regardless of the whims and the values of the sitting governments of the day, kept the work of gender equality alive, kept tools like GBA Plus sharp and applicable in Canadian context, and have worked tirelessly with limited resources to help transform an agency into a full department and help meet the additional demands on their expertise with a feminist government. The department that will now be called WAGE, or the Department for Women and Gender Equality, will now have a mandate that is wide to scope to include the advancement of equality, including social, economic, political, with respect to sex, with respect to gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, rurality, indigeneity, immigration, and immigrant status, as well as ensuring that we take into account the wide range of varieties that Canadians find themselves in. The proactive pay equity legislation that's included in this bill, Bill C-86, Mr. Speaker, is historic. It's a historic step that ensures that women in federally regulated industries, whether it's the public service or others, are paid equally for work of equal value. In doing so, we consulted with employees and employers, advocacy organizations, and worked to strike a balance between the recommendations that came from the Bilson report, as well as the hard work and the report presented to the House on the committee that worked on pay equity. Proactive pay equity legislation is part of our government's efforts to get our own house in order and to continue to lead by example and hopefully compel other employers to do the same. The third item that I'd like to speak to, Mr. Speaker, is gender budgeting. BIA2 includes legislation that enshrine gender budgeting into law. This will ensure that future governments apply a gender and diversity lens to their budgetary decisions. This is an important example of how our government is working to ensure that an intersectional gendered lens is applied to our decision makings, including the federal budget. Mr. Speaker, the fourth item I'd like to speak to is a new benefit to advance gender equality. Our government's 5-week EI, use it or lose it, parental sharing benefit, which is available to two-parent families, including adoptive and same-sex couples, proposes to provide greater flexibility, particularly for mothers to return to work sooner if they so choose. It encourages the second parent to take part in the work that is caring for a newborn. We know that it will help shape and change some of the gender norms around who provides the care. And we also know that for mothers who experience postpartum depression, that having that additional support in those early days will provide some relief. The fifth item that I'd like to speak to, Mr. Speaker, is a budget measure that is tabled by our government that will implement and ensure that survivors of family violence receive 5 days of paid leave. This is something that advocates, women's organizations, unions have told us that these 5 days will ensure that when she experience that violence, that they have some time to figure out next steps, to come up with a plan, to take a time out, whatever that may be. I'm proud that this is something that we heard from advocates across Canada and we listened. Mr. Speaker, regardless of our political persuasions, we all agree that nobody should have to live in fear, in economic uncertainty, of not having access to a decent job or being paid less for work of equal value. Everyone should have the opportunity to succeed in this great country, no matter their gender, gender identity, age, language, origin, race, abilities, rurality, or other identity factors. I encourage my honourable colleagues in this House to support this bill. The measures introduced, combined with our government's ongoing efforts, like support for women's organizations, like childcare, like a national housing strategy that has a carve-out for women who are escaping violence, like the work we're doing to support women entrepreneurs and women leaders like Daughters of the Vote. All of these measures combined will ensure greater equality in Canada, will grow Canada's middle class, and to support those working hard to join it. Mr. Speaker, I hope that colleagues support Bill C-86, and I'm happy to answer any questions they may have.